guys. Brett has told me how positively men's life has gone this fall with the online, with the in-person, with the small groups, with the little attrition that has gone on. You've wrestled with what it means to be isolated and lonely at times as men. But if God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in unity and in relationship, how can we be that as brothers and sisters? And as you've wrestled, how do you not hoard what you've heard, but how does that help your own life, and how do you help other people? Some devotional scriptures that I've come across I want to read just to start this talk. So let's look at some of the texts that have been pondering for me right now. 1 Peter 1:3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So we have a new birth into a living hope because of Jesus Christ. Next. Now that you have been purified, now that you have purified your souls by your obedience to the truth, so that you have genuine mutual love, love one another deeply from the heart. So it's not just what we think, it's what we do. Our obedience to the truth is important. Next slide. 1 Peter 2, rid yourself therefore of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good, come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight, and live. And like living stones, let yourself be built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood with other people, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We can't drink milk forever. We've got to grow up with solid food. Next slide. And so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. Paul challenges, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you are not ready for solid food. Even now you are still not ready, for you are still of the flesh. For as long as there is jealousy, that breaks relationships, and quarreling, that breaks relationships among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? And finally, this text from Ephesians 4, Paul sums it up. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity. See, solid food. To the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, that's solid food. We must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, that's our community, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. How do we grow up from milk to solid food? In March, I was out at a conference in South Carolina and was exposed to a man named James Edwards, who's a professor emeritus at Whitworth College out in Spokane, Washington. He wrote a book recently that was published in 2019 called Between the Swastika and the Sickle, the Life, Disappearance, and Execution of Ernst Lohmeyer. I read that book, and I was so inspired by him that he moved from being someone of milk into someone of meat, solid food, that I wanted to tell his story to you for inspiration. Here's just a little bit of background about Ernst Lohmeyer. He had 2 doctoral degrees, one in theology, the other in philosophy. He was interested and an expert in the Greco-Roman world. That's the context right around where Jesus was operating in the first century. He knew Greek, which was obvious. He knew Latin. He knew the Semitic languages like Assyrian, Babylonian, Hebrew, and Aramaic, which is not as natural, as well as philosophy, music, and poetry. While he was still in his 30s, his genius bore fruit in an impressive number of articles and books published in renowned venues by equally renowned publishers. He received calls to prestigious posts at the University of Heidelberg and Breslau, receiving an honorary doctorate from the former, and was named president of the latter. His productivity, his notoriety seemed to have been graced by God. And in the midst of all that, in addition to his academic achievements, he opposed authoritarian Nazi theology. He affiliated with the Confessing Church. That was really a third of the Christians in Germany at the time of World War II in Nazi Germany. 3/4 of the people were what was called German Christians, who were in league with and in lockstep and barrel with Hitler. He was not. He was part of the German Protestant church that resisted the annexation by the state. So he wrote theology, he wrote biblical commentaries, he also wrote sermons and letters to pastors and students, and we have hundreds of letters from him to his wife while doing forced service for 9.5 years in World War I and in World War II. His character and his brilliance resulted in being named president, as I said, that to Breslau, but also to one other German university as well. At both, the first cloaked in Nazi brown and the second in communist red, he rendered unto Caesar what belonged to Caesar without rendering to either what belonged only to God, which is an incredibly fine line to walk. He was taken away by the precursor of the KGB in February 15th, 1946, and only after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was his death discovered. And in the mid-1970s, this man, James Edwards, was doing his PhD research at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. He was doing his work on the Gospel of Mark, and he came upon a commentary by Ernst Lohmeyer, which was one of the best commentaries of the day, in the acclaimed Meyer Commentary series. The first copy was done in 1936, but then there was a revision done in 1967. Normally the revision would be done by the author himself. This was revised by an editor from notes from Lohmeyer, and there was a statement in the book that caught Edwards's interest. It says, it was updated until a higher power carried him off to a still unresolved fate. So Lohmeyer, no one knew where he was, and no one knew what happened to him. Well, Edwards wanted to find out. Edwards found out that about Lohmeyer was the guy who wrote a commentary on Revelation that said the key understanding to unwrap Revelation was numerology and to understand the number 7. That was Lohmeyer, which every commentator today would affirm as being true. He wrote in between the world wars on Christ cult and Caesar cult, where he acclaimed that Jesus has our total allegiance and the state can't take the place of God, which Bonhoeffer said 10, 15, 20 years ago. Barth said 15, 20 years later. But it was Lohmeyer who was writing about this and talking about it first. Lohmeyer wrote Social Questions in Early Christianity, where he claimed first that Christianity penetrated the Roman Empire more quickly and more fully than other faiths and philosophies, and Christianity remained less affected by Rome than other faiths. In other words, Lohmeyer showed that the Christians were in with but not of the empire. Most scholars believe that they had been co-opted by Rome or influenced by Rome, but Lohmeyer said no, the first Christians influenced Rome more than they were influenced by Rome. And Lohmeyer wrote a commentary on Philippians, and especially Philippians 2, where he was the first one to say this was a hymn of Christ that was not late, but was early, and where most people thought the high view of Jesus as the Savior and Lord was late in Christendom, almost at 100 AD, Lohmeyer argued successfully that it was early, even before the Gospels were written, Philippians was written, and this hymn was a statement of faith, a creedal affirmation by the early Christians. Now that is not contested by anyone. It is affirmed because of Lohmeyer. And he wrote that Philippians was actually a letter fundamentally and ultimately about martyrdom. that I may know Christ and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And he said, every Christian must be ready in their life by witnessing to Christ to die for their faith. This was well before he would have to do that himself, but preparation in God's blessing for that. He wrote in his inauguration address at President of Breslau at age 40 that the individual cannot be dissolved into the state cannot be deified, and that was in 1931. Just as Nazism was rising, he predicted it, he saw it, he knew it was coming, and he spoke out in his inauguration address against it. And he quotes John 4:22 from Jesus, where Jesus says salvation is from the Jews. That the Jews are our spiritual parents, that we can't have a Christian faith without them, which spoke devastatingly in a critique to Nazism. After the war, he wrote on Luther's commentary to Romans, wrote about the Lord's Prayer. He was the one that said you can't understand the Lord's Prayer if you don't think about it as we, our Father who art in heaven. It's not individualist faith. He was the one that talked about Abba, that was radically new, that Jesus was the one who said we don't have a distant Father, but we have an Abba, a daddy that we can talk about. It was later Jeremias who took credit for it, but it was Lohmeyer who wrote about it first. And when I talked on the Lord's Prayer here at MDPC, I used Lohmeyer's research. That the prayer was a summary of the gospel, Christ's life, death, and resurrection. I could say a lot more about his history, but at the beginning of the book, James Edwards starts with this quote. No one knows where Ernst Lohmeyer's final resting place is, but we all know who he was and what he always will be for us, a preeminent theologian, a great man of integrity and innocence, a martyr for the freedom of the university, in the words of Israel, a righteous man among the nations. In 1996, after James Edwards had done a lot of research on Lohmeyer and went back to what was formerly East Germany, this was the card on the rehabilitation of Lohmeyer, who was named president of one of the institutions. In memory of Ernst Lohmeyer, born 7/8/1890, professor of New Testament, Greifswald, 1935 to 1946, president of the university from 5/15/1945, arrested by the NKVD, that's the precursor to the KGB, on 2/15/1946, unjustly executed. They only found that out after the Berlin Wall fell on 9/19/1946, and now exonerated on 8/15/1996. After I heard a little bit from James Edwards about this man, Ernst Lohmeyer, I got this book and I read it, and for me, there have been at least 3 takeaways, and I want to share those 3 takeaways for you. Maybe they'll be helpful for our men's life thinking as we finish up the fall. First takeaway about Ernst Lohmeyer. He worked under not ideal circumstances. The German Reich required 1 year of military service of all eligible young men, so in 1913, 1914, Ernst served. But then Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his wife were assassinated, and World War I broke out, and he had 5 years service in World War I. That was not to be his plan. That's not what he wanted. He wasn't a soldier. He was an academic. He saw combat and fierce fighting on both the Eastern and the Western fronts. He married on a leave in 1916. The war ends with Germany's defeat. There's the Treaty of Versailles, but it put harsh penalties on the country, and they were disgraced, which led quickly to bitterness. So from 1918 really to 1935 or so, he could be productive academically, but then World War II hit, and he was forced to serve again 4 more years. 9.5 total years of his productive life was as a soldier. And he had to work in those far from ideal circumstances. Either very early in the day, James Edwards' book says, or late in the evening, he would take out his Greek New Testament and study passages and write notes, and the beginnings of monographs are in all the notes he put together while he was serving in the military. We often want the gifts of the Spirit manifested in our lives in ideal circumstances, but he displayed the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, in the worst circumstances possible. He produced. And even when he was not in the war, think about this. After World War II, there was the rising of Nazism, and after World War II, there was the rising of communism. So after World War I, after World War II, it was not calm. He never had a time when he was being productive when it was easy. What that says for me, what it says maybe for us is, don't wait for some ideal scenario. Get to work on your calling, get to work on your faith, get to work on your friendships right now. There's no ideal time later. If you want to overcome isolation and loneliness, it's now or never. Not later, not when it's easy. Quit relying on milk and start eating solid food. Lohmeyer would challenge all of us. Second, in my initial talk for this fall on Men's Life, I talked about C.S. Lewis saying that we have a first friend and a second friend. The first friend we agree with completely. They're like our soulmate. Everything's easy when we're with them. They confirm all of our beliefs and they assure us of our identity. Our second friend is someone who challenges us about everything. They're Christians. They're committed to us and the goodness of the world, but they see it differently, and iron sharpens iron, and they stretch us completely. Lohmeyer, throughout this book, over and over again, showed himself to me of being an amazing first and a second friend. Let me just give you a couple examples. After World War I and the rise of Nazism was coming, Nazis wanted to muzzle and eliminate Jewish influence in Germany. And while he was serving at the first university, a 28-year-old law scholar named Ernst Joseph Cohen, who happened to be a Jew, was offered a position at Breslau. Not even in Lohmeyer's area. You know, Lohmeyer was a theologian. Lohmeyer was a New Testament scholar. This was someone in the law school. But Lohmeyer liked him. They became friends. And Elie Wiesel, who wrote later Nights, said, not everybody who was persecuted were the Jews, but every Jew was persecuted. And during the persecution, he came into Breslau, and in his opening inaugural address, Cohen was protested by students. 2 weeks, the university was shut down because of protests. Some of the faculty opposed him, not because of his competence, not because of his writing, not because of his brilliance, but because of his Jewishness. Here's what Cohen writes about Lohmeyer. Shortly before the coming to power of Nazism, Nazi-inspired student riots broke out at the university, which were chiefly directed against me. During that time, I found in Professor Lohmeyer the strongest and most determined supporter. I am still convinced that if he had been rector, the head at first, he was only the vice, deputy rector, he would have succeeded in quelling, through his strong personality and with his unfaltering democratic faith, the riots at their very start. On one occasion, when Professor Lohmeyer believed me to be personally threatened, he tried to shield me against students who wanted to attack me with his own person. Lohmeyer was a good first friend. And even though this was not his area, this was not his department, he could have avoided it. He could have not entered into it. Because this was his friend, he did. Now, how was he a good second friend? When James Edwards was on a sabbatical over in Germany, well after the Second World War, he went to Tübingen, where in Tübingen, there were many of the professors that were pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi, and there was supposedly propaganda that no one could find. He talked to one of the gardeners and the administrators of that area, and he said, "Oh, do you mean in the cupboard?" And the person had a key and showed many racist, terrible propaganda sheets from professors of Tübingen. James Edwards read them and found that one of the professors, Gerhard Kittel, who is maybe the preeminent scholar on the New Testament language in Germany at that time, and wrote many dictionaries that are still used today, Little Kittel and the Large Kittel, on understanding New Testament Greek words and translating them to English. He finds out that Kittel wrote things that said Jesus was not really a Jew, but an Aryan, which is patently false. That he found out that Kittel had written public letters against Martin Buber, the man who is a Jewish scholar who wrote the book I and Thou. And in response to that, even though Lohmeyer had never met Buber, and he was a junior colleague, and Kittel was the preeminent New Testament colleague in Germany at the time, Lohmeyer writes an open letter in support of Buber against Kittel. Here's what he says. "I have just read your open letter to Gerhard Kittel," this is to Buber, "and I am compelled to say that each word of it is spoken as if from my own heart. What compels me is not only the spiritual bond that I feel with you," Lohmeyer to Buber, "although its rarity in these days makes me especially aware of it, but rather to say openly how shameful it is that theological colleagues," he's calling out Kittel now, the preeminent person that could squelch his job advancements, "are able to think and write as they do, and that the Protestant church," he's talking about the people that are in league with Hitler, "like a ship without a captain that is driven off course by the shifting political windstorm of the president, is able to remain as silent as it does." Next. "May this letter be a token of assurance to you that not all theological professors, not even all New Testament professors, share Kittel's opinions." This is an open letter. "I hope that you will be in agreement with me in this, that the Christian faith is Christian only insofar as it bears the Jewish faith in its heart. I do not know if you will be able to also affirm the reverse, that the Jewish faith is Jewish only insofar as it preserves within itself a place for the Christian faith, that the Messiah will come." And in that letter, he says, "You are my brother." Kohlmeyer calls Buber, who's a Jew, his brother. Years before Bonhoeffer would call Jews brothers in his writing. Lohmeyer preached sermons on loving neighbor as self, taught against National Socialism. Students and then some faculty tried to oust him. They reduced him to professor, then transferred him to another university called Greifswald, the boonies, and a pro-nationalist socialist place. He was the only member of the confessing church on the faculty. They just tried to relativize him. So he pours himself into his work. He publishes 6 books. 17 scholarly articles, 2 book reviews over the next stretch. That's when he did his famous commentary on the Gospel of Mark, talking about the supremacy of Christ and that no human person can be in the place of Christ, speaking against Hitler. He writes parables. Then he's forced into World War II as a 49-year-old, as punishment. He's platoon commander in Poland. And there is a Bromberg massacre there. I'd never heard about it, but if you're a World War II scholar, maybe you had. 58,000 Polish citizens are massacred by the Germans. He's near that region. And so after the war, when the Soviet KGB is sorting out, are there any Nazi sympathizers? That's one of the reasons he's arrested. In the trial, all kinds of scholars and soldiers stand up, we learn later, for Lohmeyer. Here's one of them and what he said about Lohmeyer. "I lived with Lohmeyer day in and day out from May 1940 until April 1943. Among the troops, Lohmeyer had no enemies. His noble human qualities, his innate goodness, and his humanitarian way in which he conducted his command caused people to see him not as an officer, but as a caregiver. Everyone, and this included the Russians with whom he was in constant contact, trusted that Lohmeyer would treat requests fairly and resolve them equitably. He was never a National Socialist, and not infrequently he indulged in withering critique of the abuses of power among those who held power at the time. No one besides him could have done this with impunity. He was respected for his insistence on absolute truth as well as his uncommon sensitivity to human needs, and these qualities made even the thought of betraying him a cause for shame. Lohmeyer did not tolerate mistreatment of Russians. A captured Russian officer once had to be watched for a day and a night. Lohmeyer solved the problem by making the officer a guest in his own quarters, offering a place at his same table with the same food and tobacco as the German officer. At night, the Russian officer was put in a room with 2 beds, one for Lohmeyer and one for the German officer. Lohmeyer made a habit of turning necessity into virtue. He would not mistreat the Russians. He would not mistreat other people. The colleagues who were soldiers with him defended him, and even the Russians who were there defended him. He finally is able to leave. He never thought he'd get out of World War II. He survives even though he has dysentery. And when he comes home, he approaches his house, and this is what happens when he comes home. Listen to this slide. This is from his wife, Melly. She said, "If only I had opened my arms to him and received him with a warm and loving heart, our subsequent unhappiness would not have happened. But I was paralyzed in grief over Helgi, that's their son's gruesome death in the war, paralyzed in the loneliness of my heart that had grown callous because Ernst had been for years left me inwardly alone. He'd been away at the wars. I was like a piece of wood, and he, who had awaited this moment with the deepest expectation and hope of his soul, was the same." So one son was dead, another was severely wounded. His wife didn't hug him. She was profoundly grieving. And so he becomes the president after the war of Greifswald University. The Russians allow that, but then they're trying to find war criminals, and the Stasi secret police agents try to root out Nazi sympathizers. And about to be inaugurated when arrested in the middle of the night and never heard from again until after the Berlin Wall is open. And many pastors and professors wrote letters to defend him, that he was not a Nazi, was not a war criminal. Later, you find out that he died on September 19th, 1946. 94% of the people the Soviets arrested after the war were not really the criminals they put them out to be. Lohmeyer was one of those innocent people. And he was exonerated in 1996. Here's what he wrote at his own trial. These are parts of the transcripts. Here's what he says. "I'm a man of faith. Therefore, I could not commit these atrocities. I could not have committed the crimes of which I'm accused. I was not free not to serve in the Wehrmacht. He had to. Wherever I served in occupied territories, I sought to honor the fundamental of what it means to be human. I assure you again that I never took part in the shooting of Soviet citizens or ordered such. On the contrary, I sought in all regions to alleviate the ravages of war where I could, and made no distinction between my comrades in the German Wehrmacht or communist Soviet citizens. I did not flee after the war to the West, but stayed in the Russian sector and fulfilled the highest humanistic ideas in the administration of the University of Greifswald." His defense in the end didn't work, and he was killed. He was an amazing first, and he was an amazing second friend. Are you even to enemies in a war? He was. His faith showed forth even in those circumstances. Where is it needed in your life? Finally, the third thing. You notice as I read about his wife that there was a wound there, that wasn't a perfect thing. Back early in the book, she writes about falling in love with Ernst Lohmeyer. Here's what she says. Ernst seemed to me the purest, most transparent, and most genuine person I'd ever met in my life. His rather childlike appearance was something of a contrast to his expressive green eyes, which he inherited from his father, and his high and pensive forehead that harbored many thoughts. Those features admitted an inner will and passion. What was not yet clear to me was his tender charm, his willful balance, his sensitive disposition, and his gallantry. She fell in love with him because of the man he was, the faith commitment person he was, and they had a good life with letters over and over again during the First World War and the Second World War of care and commitment and sensitivity toward each other. But when he comes back after the end of World War II and his wife doesn't hug and kiss him, something in him breaks. He takes the presidency of Greifswald after the war without consulting her. If she's not going to love him, I'm just going to throw myself completely into my work. And emotional distance grew. In the book, it says we both were cold and dead to each other. It's interesting to me that in Edward's research, he goes back and forth to East Germany to find out more and more about Lohmeyer, and he finds the final letter of Ernst Lohmeyer that was smuggled out by soldiers. It's only was read in 2016, and I'll read that to close out my remarks. It's 8 pages long, and here are some of the things he writes. Oh, my love, something important has happened to me and in me. A jolt has set me free from so much. A gust of wind has landed me on new ground. I am still working through what happened to me. On the night when I was arrested, you came to me with light and lively steps. I was in my room with the interpreter, Russian interpreter, and you kissed me warmly and firmly on the mouth. There was a sudden knowledge of things that I had not seen until then, which my eyes had almost overlooked. A lightness of heart came almost wholly upon me. The oneness of our hearts was there. The oneness was found again, and everything was open, and there was nothing more to hide. In this way, it was bound to come. In this way, it had to happen. In everything, God's finger was clear to see. He goes on to say, it is now clear to me that for more than 20 years, I followed the wrong course. He's looking back on his life, wondering if he's going to die. He says, in conceding to your wish for another child, there were 3 kids, I decided to devote myself entirely to my work. He didn't want another child. He didn't want a 3rd child. So when there was a 3rd child, he shut down. His wife saw him shut down, and he just threw himself into his work. Believing my work was a calling from God. He said, my fundamental error was pushing everything else, including you, to second place. The miracle of Mellie's warm and loving kiss reminded Lohmeyer that what God had granted him in life had been granted with and through her. Here's what he writes. The gift of the fulfillment of my life was bound to the same fulfillment of your life. For both fulfillments were no longer divided, but like 2 roots had grown or were meant to grow into the single tree of our life. He says, forgive me. All I've done for the sake of the love that I have for me, that you have for me, and that despite all I have done, I have for you. I've looked in many places and thought to find God where he was not. And at the one place where he was present for me and should be present for me, and where I could have found him, which was in our love. See, they'd made a commitment before God in marriage. There I no longer found him. Were it not for this imprisonment and this warm kiss, and both belonging together, you and I would have remained separated. God signaled gently with his finger, and the walls crumbled, and the springs of water that had been choked burst forth. In everything now I'm free and inwardly certain, no longer because of myself, but because of the bond of unity that binds me to God and to you. James Edwards, who wrote the book, talks about in every biography there's things that we are impressed by other people, and then there are mistakes other people make. Can we learn from the mistakes for others? Edwards says, by confession, by asking for forgiveness, by making amends as possible, that's called Christian character. What he strove to be was a man of faith and character. He said, it's a question for all of us in academia, he's talking about himself as a professor, that we can make God an object instead of a subject and think if we're working and writing about God, it's the same as having a relationship with God. And even though we've made commitments to our wife and our kids, that those take a second or a third or a fourth seat to that endeavor. He said it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be a both and. Here's how he finishes. In cell 19, which is where Lohmeyer was before he died, Lohmeyer came to himself as Jesus said of the younger son who abandoned his home and father for a distant land. In coming to himself, the son returned to the father to receive what the father ever longed to give. Lohmeyer hoped that God would use the personal renewal he experienced in cell 19 so that he could return to his family as a new and better husband and father, to his scholarship as a new and a better scholar, to his faith as a more faithful disciple. God used the renewal to prepare him for other ends than Lohmeyer wished. On September 19th, 1946, he fulfilled a vow he made way back in 1926 when he was writing about Philippians and martyrdom. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, and in so doing to be conformed to his death. That's the end of the book. Lohmeyer was far from perfect, but something of a Bonhoeffer, something of a Barth, and we might never have heard of him without James Edwards. Most people will probably not hear about you farther than Houston, Texas. Know about you farther than Houston, Texas. But your faithfulness, your commitment, your friendships matter. They can have a huge impact now and into eternity. But you can't stay on the milk of the faith. You have to move to the meat. You have to move to solid food. I have to move to solid food. We have to mature to be like Lohmeyer, who was forged in the fire, and then his character was revealed in the fire. This is the time, not later. Not down the road. Now, to step up. Now to follow through. Now to walk out your faith. Now to seek reconciliation where you can. It's now or maybe never. Where in the life and the death of Lohmeyer are you inspired? How might you imitate him as he tried to imitate Christ?